raiser. Excellent. Thank you for raising your hands. I presume there are a few people who have not attended the first webinar, which is fine, and we will go over the logistics. For those of you who have actually attended the first webinar, you may recall this picture from the first webinar. And using your question area, tell me if you know the name of the film or the name of the person in the picture, using your question write-in area. All right, I'm not seeing that anybody knows the name of the film or the person in the picture, so I will inform you. The movie is Freaks, directed by Todd Browning, and the character is Josephine. And I'm starting with this particular image because in this particular film, a person who's portrayed as transgender is very obviously discriminated against. It's a very controversial film, and this particular character really jumped out at me. Let's go over a few logistics before we get into the content of today's webinar. What you're looking at now is your control panel, and there are a few things I'd like to direct your attention to on the control panel. First, if you'd like to close the control panel, push that orange box with the white arrow in it. If you'd like to reopen it, just hit it again and the control panel will reopen. During this webinar, which will be interactive, I'm going to ask that you feel free at any time to write any particular question using your question window. Would somebody go ahead and submit a question right now just to practice using their window? Ask me about the weather in New York City. How are you today is the question. I am doing very well. Thank you so much for using your question window. Again, you may ask questions at any time during the course of this webinar, and I will answer them throughout the course. We'll also have a formal question and answer period. As some of you have done already, I've asked you to raise your hands. This is the button that you click on to electronically raise your hand. I will be asking you during the course of the webinar a variety of questions that I'm going to ask you to raise your hand for. Keep in mind too, folks, that the question area is for comments as well. You don't have to use that just for questions. If you'd like to make a comment, feel free to submit it there as well. I'd like to thank our funders, the Bureau of Justice Assistance and American University, in collaboration with the Training Institute at NDRI, for sponsoring this webinar. My name is Paul Warren, and I will be your presenter today. A little bit about me. I did the webinar last week, and I've had the fortunate opportunity to do co-occurring disorder webinars in the past. I am a staff member here at NDRI. I'm a program manager, and I've been at NDRI almost 10 years now. I'm also a social worker by training. Let's talk a little bit about the goal of this particular webinar. We spent some time talking about gender in a preliminary way last week. This week we're going to talk about gender in a bit more detail, and we're going to be very clear about its relationship with sexual orientation and its lack of relationship with sexual orientation. We'll also spend some time talking about best practices that drug court teams and individuals can use when working with people who are gender nonconforming or who have a sexual orientation other than heterosexual. Can anyone tell me what this particular picture is? If you know what this is a picture of, raise your hand. Okay, Adam seems to know what it is. Adam, use your question window and tell us where you think the picture is. It is definitely Earth. It is definitely an aerial view of land. Actually, what it is, it's the natural entrance to the mouth of a cavern. I chose a cave, yes. I chose that particular image because we are going to go deeper and more underground into gender and what the relationship between gender and sexual orientation is. We have a few specific learning objectives. One of them is by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to state at least two components of gender. You'll be able to define sexual orientation. You will be able to identify at least two differences between gender and sexual orientation and state the definition of transgender, and you'll be able to list at least two best practices when working with gender nonconforming people. I also want to draw your attention to the bottom of this particular slide. As in the earlier slide, this is the telephone number that you'll want to dial if you are having any type of audio or visual problems accessing this particular webinar. We're now going to move to our first poll. And I am going to give you some time to cast your votes, and please cast only one vote during the poll. I'm now closing the poll, and I'm sharing the results. 100% of you said that expressing gender outside of the cultural prescription. Excellent. Everyone gets the answer correct. I'm very happy to see that. And we'll just go back to the definition that we threw out for gender during last week's webinar, which was that gender is culturally derived and defined, and it's the expectations about femaleness and maleness and what people are supposed to do, what each sex is supposed to do, how they're supposed to behave, how they're supposed to present themselves. My hope is that by the end of this particular webinar, we'll really be able to think of gender not in the binary as it's generally thought of, A for women, B for men, but we'll think of it on a continuum, from A to Z and beyond Z, gender as a journey, not a destination. There are 4 parts of gender that I'd like us to take a moment to actually focus on. Let's talk a little bit about gender identity, expression, role, and attribution. When we're talking about gender identity, we are talking about someone's intrinsic, personal, deep understanding of themselves as a female or a male, or on some sort of continuum, however they define it for themselves internally. They may or may not share this with the outside world, but it's how they identify themselves in terms of their maleness, femaleness, or somewhere on a continuum. When we speak of gender expression is what somebody shares with the outside world. It is often thought of as the prescribed or personal expression of femaleness, maleness, also on a continuum. And we say prescribed here because, again, The culture often defines gender in a very binary way. A for females, B for males. Gender expression is expressed through clothing, hair, mannerisms, makeup. Gender role is basically what the culture decides. I'm getting feedback that the slides are not there, that people can't see the slides. Let's see what I can do about that. Let me know with your question window if the slides have reappeared. Ah, excellent. Good. Thank you very much, everybody. Let me go back a slide. Again, gender expression. I wanted to show this picture because you can see in this particular picture that this woman is applying makeup, the colors of the makeup, the sheer fact that the thing she's holding in front of her is pink. The picture really spoke to me about gender expression. Again, gender role, the cultural roles that are assigned to men and women based on their assigned sex at birth. And that may sound familiar from last week's webinar, sex at birth, chromosomes, genitalia. The last piece that we'll focus on here is gender attribution. This one's particularly interesting because it is a subjective view or assumption about an individual based on their gender expression. So every day we look at people, we see them, and we make assumptions about their gender identity. We make assumptions about their sexual orientation based on their gender expression. This is something that we contribute. We look at somebody, we do the math, and we decide what the answer is. Sometimes our math is incorrect based on our assumptions. If you know who this is a picture of, raise your hand. And if you know the person's name, please type it in your question box. Okay, nobody seems to know who it is, so I will reveal the identity of this individual. And I particularly chose this picture because you may notice that this man is dressed in a fur coat. This is Edward Gorey, a famous artist who, if you've ever seen the PBS show Mystery, did the animated credits amongst many other works. I mention him and show this picture because in some ways he's considered gender non-conforming by the sheer fact that he wore a fur coat all the time, a full-length fur coat. And again, he's balding and sports a full beard and mustache. Here's our next poll. And I can see that people are voting. Excellent. I will give it a few more seconds. We have 29% of people who have voted. So if you have not voted, please vote. And again, I know that you need a little more time to review the polls. So I'm holding it open until the greatest percentage of you have cast your votes. And again, please only vote once. About 65% of you have voted at this particular point. Now 71% of you have voted. Let's see if we can get it to a full 100. 82%. Going once. Going twice. The poll is now closed. These are the results. 29% of you indicated that your belief is that sexual orientation is the same as sexual preference. 71% of you said an enduring pattern of sexual and emotional attraction. And here's the answer. An enduring pattern of emotional and sexual attraction to others of a particular sex or to both sexes. Sexual orientation is an intrinsic personal characteristic, and it's often thought of as on a continuum, just like gender identity. Exclusively attracted to the same sex is only one sexual orientation of many sexual orientations. Let's talk a little bit about sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is not often thought of as three separate components, but my hope is that during the course of this webinar, you will actually think of sexual orientation in three specific ways when you think of it. There is attraction, emotional and physical attraction. There's also identity, identity to oneself, how you identify your sexual orientation to yourself, and how you also identify your sexual orientation to the outside world. Now keep in mind that sexual attraction and identity may or may not match. You may be sexually attracted to women exclusively, but for various circumstances you identify in certain contexts as a man who has sex with men, perhaps for money. Then there's the third part, behavior. What somebody actually does sexually and with whom they do it. Again, you may have a particular sexual attraction. You may be exclusively sexually and emotionally attracted to women, and your sexual behavior is that you engage in sex with a particular man who you might be married to, and you may have a family or children. These three particular areas do not always add up, and they're very personal and very individual. Human sexuality is very complex and very unique. Let's talk a little bit about sexual preference, because earlier when some of you voted, you talked about sexual orientation being the same as sexual preference. Actually, sexual preference really speaks more to the behavior part. What do you prefer to do? Do you like vanilla ice cream or do you like strawberry ice cream? That is preference. Sexual orientation is not a choice. People do not choose their sexual orientations. They choose what behaviors they are going to engage in. Chances are, if I would have asked many of you when you chose your sexual orientation, you may have simply said, well, I don't really recall making a choice. It was just there. I'd also suggest that the phrase sexual preference is especially problematic because it's often used as a tool to oppress individuals and discriminate against them. Basically saying, you're choosing to do this. This is your preference. You could choose something else. People cannot choose a different sexual orientation. They can choose to engage in different sexual behaviors. The American Psychological Association has also weighed in on the topic of sexual orientation. They've suggested and stated that it is not a choice. It's an intrinsic personal characteristic. It's usually determined by a variety of factors. Again, we talked about human sexuality as being very complex. At least since 1973, same-sex sexual orientation is not considered a mental illness or an emotional problem, and that has been since 1973. And the other thing to consider based on what the APA is saying, and also recently in the news today, that sexual orientation cannot be changed by reparative or conversion therapy. Behavior is what's changed. The orientation is not changed. Again, a final point here. Sexual orientation, emotional and sexual attraction that one feels for others is not the same thing as gender identity. Gender identity is one's intrinsic self-identification of personal femaleness, maleness, or somewhere on a continuum. And keep in mind that gender identity is not always visible to others. Somebody may have a particular gender identity and it is actually not visible based on their gender expression. And keep in mind that transgender, if someone is a transgendered individual, they are not necessarily lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Many transgendered individuals are indeed heterosexual. I have a question here. What is the best way to ask a client when you have a question about their sexual orientation? That's a wonderful question. It's a practice question. I think the first thing that you would really want to ask yourself is why in particular you're asking that question. And is it pertinent and germane to the work that you're doing? If you are asking that question, you may want to ask yourself, do I ask this question to all of my participants, or am I just asking this particular participant? And you'll really want to watch nonverbal communication from yourself and from the participant to see how the question is being asked. The way I might ask the question if I was in the situation is I might say, we generally ask this question to everybody, do you have sex with women, men, or both? But again, you want to normalize it that this is a normal question that you ask all participants. And of course, first and foremost, check with yourself about why you're asking this question. Yes, and I'm also seeing that you're asking this because you do observed urine drug screens. And again, that may or may not have anything to do with sexual orientation. We'll come to that a little bit later in the process, and I'm sure that question will resurface, which is a good thing. So if you think you know who this is a picture of, please send me the person's name in your question box. And if they look familiar but you don't know their name, please raise your hand. Tenzing has a hand raised. Yes, it is Dietrich. This is a picture of Marlena Dietrich, and again I include this here because if you'll notice by looking at the picture, this is a wonderful example of someone who is expressing gender in a gender non-conforming way. Marlena is actually wearing a suit and a tie and is dressed how you might assume a man of that period would be dressed. We'll now go to our next poll. %, of you have currently voted. I'm holding out for at least 80 this time, and I'll give you enough time to read all the responses. $56 of you, 67% of you have voted. Let's go for 80. We're almost there, 72, 78%. Somebody take us over into 80. Going once, going twice. The poll is now officially closed. And here are the results. 50% of you, as you can see there, suggested that transgender people conform to culturally defined gender roles. That is incorrect. The other 50% of you who voted said include only individuals who have had the operation. That is also incorrect. The correct answer is transgender people are diagnosed mentally ill to get hormone treatment. In order for a transgender person to get hormones or sex reassignment surgery, they must receive a diagnosis of gender identity disorder. So transgender people are medically stigmatized because they are desiring to express their true gender identity. So let's talk a little bit about what transgender actually means. There are many different types of transgendered individuals. Yes, before I go over this particular slide, I do want to acknowledge that somebody typed in, that is so wrong. And my sense is that, and I'm hoping that this is what you're suggesting, is that it's so wrong that transgendered people have to receive a psychiatric diagnosis in order to express their gender identity and become who they know themselves to be. Transgender is a term, an umbrella term, that basically describes individuals whose gender identities or expression or behaviors are different from those than are culturally determined, A for women, B for men. And behaviors, expressions that are, again, associated with their assigned sex at birth. And I've also included another picture of Mayor Stu Rasmussen from Silverton, Oregon, as a very public and wonderful example of someone who is a transgender individual and has had some degree of hormone therapy and sex reassignment surgery. Now, we are also going to talk specifically about a variety of transgender people. When we think of conventionally gendered identities, we're thinking of A for women, B for men. And those rigid sort of structures actually cloud the reality of other gender identities, especially transgender identities. We can think of transgendered individuals in a couple of ways. Transsexual individuals are individuals that often have the experience of being born in the wrong body. Some transsexual individuals do not have any kind of sex reassignment surgery. Some have sex reassignment surgery, and some are in the process of awaiting sex reassignment surgery. In order to be a transsexual, or thought of as a transsexual, one does not actually have to have sex reassignment surgery. Then another way of looking at transgender individuals is transvestites, cross-dressers, drag queens, and drag kings. Cross-dressers are individuals who dress in the clothing of the opposite sex. Someone who is a cross-dresser is not necessarily a lesbian, a gay person, or bisexual. They may be heterosexual. A drag queen or a drag king is somebody who generally dresses in clothing and performs in clothing of the opposite sex. Then another variation on this are gender variant or gender non-conforming people. An example of that people may be able to identify with is someone like David Bowie and other sort of public personalities. And again, when one has power and money, one can express oneself in any way that one wants with few consequences. But again, transgendered individuals are people who do not express themselves in the gender binary that the culture prescribes. Transgendered individuals go through what can be called transitioning or a transition, and people can transition in a variety of different ways. They can use clothing and makeup to alter their appearance. They can live for short periods in their preferred gender identity, or they can live extended periods. Some have hormone therapy, some do not. Some have gender-affirming surgeries, top surgery. Stu Rasmussen is a perfect example of that, or reconstructive surgery in terms of genitalia. People find a variety of places anywhere along the spectrum of transitioning that work for them, and there's no right way for a transgender individual to transition. It really has everything to do with their feeling about their gender identity. Here's a composite photograph of Parinya, who's a very famous boxer from Thailand. And you'll notice I've included this picture because it really exemplifies sort of steps in transitioning. You'll notice a change in makeup. You'll start to notice a change in body shape. That's due to hormone therapy. The sad piece of this particular story is that Parinya brought himself out of poverty through his boxing championships, and when Parinya finally made her transition, she was actually barred from boxing, and now she teaches boxing because she is no longer allowed to box because of her preferred gender identity. So in closing around this, transgender, we're speaking about gender identity. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation. Queer identity is a blend between gender identity and sexual orientation that does not prescribe to a heterosexual construct and also does not prescribe to gender identity expressed in the binary, A for women, B for men. When we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and heterosexual, and anywhere on that continuum, we're focusing on sexual orientation. We'll now go to our next poll. And let's see if we can get 80% here as well. %28 of you have currently voted. %67 of you have currently voted. All right, I'm going to close the poll now. And here are the results. 8% of you suggested that having a heterosexual orientation is associated with high suicide rates. That's actually inaccurate. LGBT individuals are actually having that sexual orientation, actually LG or B, or being a transgendered individual, is actually more associated with high suicide rates. And again, 92% of you got the correct answer, which having a heterosexual sexual orientation allows an individual not to have to consider their sexual orientation. So let's talk about some specific cultural dynamics that impact people around gender and sexual orientation. There's a term that's used, transphobia, also sometimes referred to as gender phobia. Fear, hatred, and aversion, contempt, and prejudice towards people who challenge the accepted norms of gender conception. And again, these are individual behaviors and also institutional practices that discriminate against people who do not present in what the culture says is quote-unquote normal. And one thing to keep in mind in regard to this is that conformity around gender expression certainly has its privileges, and lack of conformity for transgendered individuals has serious consequences. And actually not only for transgendered individuals. And we'll get to that when we talk about homophobia. Homophobia is, I'm noticing that someone is having trouble seeing the slides. Let's see. Let me know if it's come back. Yes, excellent, good. Thank you for your feedback, greatly appreciated. When we're talking about homophobia, we're also talking about fear, hatred, aversion, contempt, and prejudice against lesbians and gay men. I think the important thing to consider here in regard to homophobia is that individuals can have what's called internalized homophobia, meaning that they hate their own internal feelings that they may themselves identify as homosexual, being attracted to someone of the same sex. It also unfortunately plays out that, especially for men, there is a huge barrier to actually allowing oneself to get close to someone of the same sex because of the fear of what it will mean, an individual's subjective understanding of that, and how that closeness will be perceived by others who might view it. And again, conformity here definitely has its privileges. Now let's talk specifically about another dynamic that is at play here. Heterosexism. It was first published in 1971, actually by a gay rights activist named Craig Rodwell. And basically, the precept behind this particular ism, not unlike racism, is beliefs and practices that give unearned and oftentimes unconscious social privileges to people presumed to be heterosexual or those that pass as heterosexual. There are basically four particular assumptions that this particular heterosexist perspective assumes. One is that heterosexuality is inherently superior to any other sexual orientation. It's more normal, moral, or desirable, and that everyone should be or would rather be a heterosexual, and that LGBT people are sinful, immoral, and abnormal. We'll now go to our next poll. Six percent of you have currently voted. 56% of you have voted. We'll give it a few more seconds and see if we can hit 80. We're almost there. We're at 78%. Now we're at 83%. I'll give it 2 more seconds and then we'll close the poll. The poll is now closed. Here are the results. 27% of you suggested that simply treat everyone the same. I've often heard people say that, we don't really need cultural sensitivity around these particular issues or cultural competence because we treat everyone the same. Well, the reality is not everyone is the same. So the same treatment doesn't necessarily work for every participant. 13% of you suggested that you should tell the person how they are expected to behave. Again, you'll want to consider your goal. Is your goal to help this person to complete the program, or is it to impose your particular attitudes, values, and beliefs? And 53% of you suggested get education and supportive supervision. This is probably the best prescription if indeed you are uncomfortable with gender nonconforming people or people who have a sexual orientation other than your own. Now let's focus, as we start to bring the webinar to a close, about specific practice strategies when working with gender nonconforming people and people who may have a sexual orientation other than heterosexual. You might want to consider working with people who are LGBT, that they may approach seeking help with a lot of anxiety and guardedness, mostly based on how they've been treated in the past. I mention here that you might want to practice acceptance, meaning you don't necessarily have to agree with someone's sexual acts or sexual desires, but you can practice acceptance through culturally competent practice. And you'd also want to assure confidentiality so people can feel comfortable talking with you about what's really going on with them, if that is indeed appropriate to your work with them. You may also want to consider knowing and checking in with yourself what your attitudes, values, and beliefs are in hearing about transgendered individuals' experiences of their lives, the relationships in their lives, the sexual behaviors that people engage in. If you find yourself having these feelings, you need to act to grow your skills. And again, seeking supervision and education is important. And you can also go back to the goals of why you're doing this particular work. You do want to create a safe, a welcome, and supportive environment so that every drug court participant gets the opportunity to succeed, regardless of their sexual orientation and your feelings about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. You can also work on practicing a non-judgmental attitude. These are skills that can be grown over time, and things you'll want to consider is, are you using open-ended questions? Are you paraphrasing? This shows that you're actually listening. Are you using non-judgmental and inclusive language? Are you checking for heterosexual assumptions, that if a man comes to you and talks to you about someone that they're in a relationship with, that you assume that the individual means a woman? And are you avoiding stereotypes, that every transgender person must be X, Y, or Z? You'll also want to be aware of your body language, how you're using eye contact or not using it, how you set up your office. And also, you'll want to develop an attention and an attunement to the body language of the participant that you're working with. If you notice that they're uncomfortable with terminology that you're using, explore it. Ask them what words or terminology would feel more comfortable for them. Again, you can use inclusive language that doesn't make assumptions about gender identity, sexual orientation, and behaviors or relationships. Hopefully, by using inclusive language, you can convey that you are potentially open to hearing about these parts of a person's life, again, especially if it's germane to your work with them. As I mentioned, You can use inclusive language by saying, what is the level of your commitment in your significant relationship, as opposed to how long have you been married? Use the word that the individual uses. If they use the word partner, use their word. Follow their lead. And I also gave this example earlier. If you do need to ask about sexual behaviors, get into the habit of asking everybody, do you have sex with men, women, or both? Again, if it's germane and appropriate to your work. You can also create an LGBT welcome environment by providing particular visuals that LGBT people will identify with and will communicate to them that it's a safe environment, such as posters that have pictures of them. The rainbow flag is often a symbol or sign that is identified, having brochures that address the issue. A posted non-discrimination policy. Ask yourself, do we actually have a non-discrimination policy? Having LGBT-specific media, magazines available, newsletters, and making sure that all the forms that you have actually use terms such as transgender, male to female, partner as opposed to spouse. We'll now go to our last poll. All right. You're looking at the results? Yes. Gender nonconformity means expressing gender outside the cultural binary. A for women, B for men. Again, you can really help LGBT people feel welcome as an individual or as a team by being aware of your attitudes, values, and beliefs about LGBT people, using inclusive language and the proper preferred pronouns, and a commitment to support the opportunity of success for everybody in your drug court. Also by having openly out LGBT staff people in your drug court, if you indeed have them. Especially for transgender individuals, having a universal gender-inclusive restroom, not just a men's and women's room. And in some states, there are laws that protect and support the rights of transgendered individuals to use the restroom of their preferred gender identity. And you need to know those laws. Also, be aware of local LGBT resources that you can find on the internet and direct people to specific resources. So just as a way of closing the practice strategy area, try and become aware and avoid heterosexual assumptions. Gender-specific pronouns to participants, significant others, until they use them. Use the word partner until you know what word the individual uses, and be aware of different relationship types. Some people don't have the opportunity to get legally married. Some people have relationships where they have more than one partner. Become aware of gender assumptions. If you're not sure what someone's gender identity is, ask them. I don't want to make any assumptions. Which personal pronoun would you like me to use in reference to you? If the person gives you a name, and maybe they're giving you their legal name, that doesn't fit their apparent gender expression, ask them, do they have another name that they prefer to go by? Listen to the individual and get the pronouns right. Showing that kind of respect builds trust. And the bottom line of it is for many people, this can be very challenging. Even if you're an LGBT person yourself, it can be challenging. If you make a mistake, apologize and proceed. Specifically, what drug courts can do and focus on is know your own experience, attitudes, values, and beliefs. Ask yourself, do you know LGBT people? Chances are, if you don't know any LGBT people who are out to you, you may have particular attitudes, values, and beliefs. Knowing an LGBT person has actually been shown to actually help people to understand LGBT people in a more human way. Providers and teams can work together to actually acknowledge and address the presence of an LGBT person. You may have one LGBT person in your drug court. You'll also want to specifically consider contexts. The context between you and an individual, the context between that individual and the drug court, the context of that individual's life when they leave the drug court. And the goal, hopefully, in the context that you have control over, are to provide safety, respect, and equal opportunity. The last bullet here, I think, is a particularly important one in the sense that talk is cheap. One has to take actions in order to assure the best hope of success for all drug court participants. Now we can move to more questions if people have them. I see one that just came in. If the client chooses not to disclose their sexual orientation, how do you address in the group process? I think I'd probably need to know a little bit more about that particular question, especially given that you would want to respect the right of somebody to choose to not disclose their sexual orientation if they don't want to. And again, let's be clear about what we're talking about here, that we're specifically talking about sexual orientation and not their gender identity. In terms of you don't have a transgender female to male participating in an all-male group, and then there's some concern about that particular individual's gender identity. But again, you certainly would want to respect somebody's right to not explore or have to talk about their sexual orientation in a group where they may not feel comfortable doing that. And the individual who asked this question, if you can give a little bit more information on it, maybe I can respond to it more clearly. Other questions at this particular point? All right, I want to go back to a question that was actually mentioned twice, which is about urine screen process for transgender clients. Ultimately, I think what this will come down to is a drug court by drug court process of deciding what the protocol is going to be. Ultimately, you want the participant to be comfortable, and you'd also want the staff person to be comfortable. So it really is about engaging in a process given that the unique needs of the individual participant and the unique needs of the staff person both have to be considered. I think it's very productive for teams to actually have this conversation and figure out what is going to work for everybody. Again, because you want to create a process that assures the best hope for success, safety, acceptance, and respect for the transgender participant in the drug court. I'll also add before we close the webinar and go to the post-webinar questionnaire that clearly, based on some of the responses that I received, there are strong feelings about this. It's really great that people are putting that out, and it's something, if your intention truly is to provide equal opportunity and equal chance for success for every participant in drug court, it's really important to acknowledge those strong feelings to yourself and to your team, and to work that out so that you can choose, using the tools that I outlined, to practice in a competent way when working with people who are gender nonconforming and who may have a sexual orientation other than your own. And the other thing to keep in mind too, and I'll just simply state this again, is that you want to really make sure that you're not assuming that just because somebody is transgender, they are indeed L, G, or B. I'm getting a few more questions, and we have a few more minutes. What is the name of the boxer again? Perinya. And you will be sent this slide set. I believe Tenzin will send you the slide set, and I would recommend that you Google her. And there's also a really wonderful, Tenzin has said that the slide set has already been sent. So you can find the full name in the slide set. But there is also a movie that is about Perenya's life and transition. I'm getting another question. Is there any evidence on the statistics of substance use problems with transgender people? Are they higher or lower than the percentage of the represent in population? There is statistical data on this. It also includes L, G, and B people, and I don't think this will be a surprise to anyone. It is indeed higher. And again, consider the social stigma, the discrimination that transgendered individuals receive in just trying to go through their everyday life. There's a very provocative and powerful study that came out, and you can Google this. It's called Injustice at Every Turn. It's a study of a fairly large national cohort of transgender people, and it talks specifically about the types of discrimination that transgender people experience. Also keep in mind that oftentimes transgender people cannot get consistent employment and may engage in sex work as a way to make money to survive, and given their involvement in sex work and the trauma and abuse they may experience, substances may also come into play in regard to that as well. Other questions? We have about 1 more minute left. If there are no further, oh, I see one more question. Let me, okay. All right. I see that there are no more questions at this particular point. So I, again, will thank you very much for your participation in today's webinar. I'd like to thank our funders, the Bureau of Justice Assistance and American University, for the opportunity to share this information with you. And again, I encourage you and ask you to please complete your post-webinar survey. Your feedback is very important and meaningful to us as we continue to develop these webinars to meet your particular needs. And again, thank you very much for your participation today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for the compliment.